Sometimes the most powerful executives are the most powerless when it comes to matters of the heart. When a ruthless CEO mocked a humble single father's homemade lunch, she never expected him to respond with a challenge that would transform her world forever. What started as corporate cruelty became a journey of healing, hope, and the discovery that love often comes wrapped in aluminum foil and served with a side of humility. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The aroma of garlic and oregano drifted through the construction site like a whispered promise of something better than the usual sandwich truck fare. David Martinez sat on a stack of lumber, carefully unwrapping the aluminum foil around his lunch while cement dust settled on his work boots. Around him, the skeleton of what would become Thompson Industries' new research facility stretched toward the Oregon sky, all steel beams and possibility. He had packed the meal at 5 that morning before Emma woke up, the same ritual he'd maintained for 3 years since everything changed. The lasagna was nothing fancy, just layers of pasta, ricotta, and a meat sauce he'd learned to make during his brief stint at Romano's kitchen before life demanded more practical choices. But it was warm, it was real, and it reminded him of Sunday dinners when laughter echoed through their small apartment instead of the quiet that now filled the spaces between his daughter's questions about when mommy was coming home. David took his first bite, savoring the blend of herbs he'd grown on their tiny balcony, when the sound of expensive heels clicking against concrete interrupted his momentary peace. He looked up to see a woman in a charcoal gray suit approaching, her blonde hair pulled back in a severe bun that matched the sharp lines of her expression. Even from a distance, he could sense the authority that seemed to radiate from her like heat from asphalt. Sarah Thompson had built her empire on precision, control, and the ability to see weakness before it could infect her bottom line. At 32, she commanded a tech company worth $200 million, employed over 800 people, and had been featured on the cover of Forbes twice. She did not have time for construction delays, cost overruns, or workers who treated her building site like their personal dining room. She had come to check on the progress of the renovation, expecting to find crews working efficiently toward their deadline. Instead, she found this man sitting among her expensive materials, eating what appeared to be a home-cooked meal as if he were at his own kitchen table. The audacity of it struck her like a physical blow. Sarah approached with the confidence of someone who had never been told no by anyone whose opinion mattered. David noticed her advance and quickly began to rewrap his lunch, assuming she was there to tell him eating wasn't allowed in this area. He had worked enough construction jobs to recognize the look of management bearing down on labor, but Sarah wasn't content with a simple dismissal. Something about the scene irritated her beyond reason, perhaps because it reminded her of the domestic life she had deliberately avoided, or maybe because his contentment seemed so foreign to her own perpetual state of controlled anxiety. She stopped directly in front of him, close enough that he had to crane his neck to meet her eyes. "Is this what passes for lunch breaks in your company?" Sarah asked, her voice carrying the kind of crisp authority that could slice through steel. "Because I'm paying for productivity, not for workers to have elaborate picnics on my property." David stood slowly, his lunch still half wrapped in his hands. He was tall enough that she had to look up slightly, which seemed to annoy her further. "Just taking my 30 minutes, ma'am. I can move if this area is off limits." Sarah's eyes fixed on the foil package in his hands, and something about it triggered a deeper irritation. Perhaps it was the care with which it had been wrapped, or the way the aroma still lingered in the air, speaking of time and attention she had never learned to give to anything that didn't generate revenue. "What exactly is that?" she asked, gesturing at his lunch with the kind of disdain usually reserved for infectious diseases. David glanced down at the aluminum foil, confused by the intensity of her interest. "Lasagna. Made it last night after my daughter went to bed." The word daughter seemed to register with Sarah like a foreign concept. She had spent so many years in boardrooms dominated by men who treated family as a weakness to be managed that the idea of a father who cooked elaborate meals for his child struck her as both inefficient and somehow performative. "You made lasagna," she repeated, as if he had claimed to have built a rocket ship. "For a construction site lunch?" "Yes, ma'am." Sarah laughed, but it wasn't a sound that contained any warmth. It was the laugh she used in negotiations when someone had overestimated their position, sharp and cutting, and designed to establish dominance. "That's probably the most ridiculous thing I've heard this week. Do you know what I had for lunch? A protein bar and coffee because I don't have time to play house." David felt heat rise in his chest, not from embarrassment but from something deeper and more protective. The laugh hadn't just mocked his lunch, it had mocked the 2 hours he'd spent the night before moving quietly around their tiny kitchen while Emma slept, preparing something that would give him a moment of comfort during the long workday ahead. "With all due respect, ma'am, I wasn't playing anything. I was feeding myself." Sarah's eyebrows rose at what she perceived as insubordination. "Feeding yourself lasagna, that probably took hours to make when you could grab a sandwich and get back to work. That's exactly the kind of inefficiency that keeps people stuck in jobs like this." The words hung in the air between them like smoke from an electrical fire, acrid and dangerous. Around them, other workers had begun to notice the confrontation, though they maintained enough distance to avoid being drawn into whatever was happening between the lady in the expensive suit and Martinez. David looked at her for a long moment, taking in the sharp angles of her face, the perfectly manicured nails, the way she held herself like someone who had never doubted her right to judge others. He thought about Emma, who would ask him tonight what he had for lunch, and would smile when he told her about the lasagna, because she had helped him choose the cheese at the grocery store. "You know what, ma'am, you're right, I could grab a sandwich. But I choose to make my lunch because it reminds me that even in the middle of the hardest days, there's still something worth savoring." He paused, studying her expression. "When's the last time you savored anything?" Sarah's jaw tightened. She was not accustomed to being questioned by employees, much less by construction workers who apparently had time to philosophize about lunch. "I savor success, I savor profit margins. I savor beating my competitors to market with innovations that change industries." "That's not what I asked." The simple statement seemed to catch her off guard. Sarah had spent years surrounding herself with people who accepted her deflections, who understood that challenging Sarah Thompson directly was career suicide. But this man with dusty boots and calloused hands was looking at her like he expected an actual answer. "I don't have time for this conversation," she said, but her voice lacked its earlier certainty. David nodded slowly. "You probably don't. But you took the time to come over here and mock what I eat, so maybe you do have time. Maybe you just choose to spend it tearing down instead of building up." Sarah felt something shift in her chest, an unfamiliar sensation that might have been shame if she had been in the habit of acknowledging such emotions. She had come here to assert control, to remind everyone.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Present that this was her project and her money at stake. Instead, she found herself engaged in a philosophical debate with a man whose life she couldn't begin to understand. "Fine," she said, her voice taking on the tone she used when closing difficult deals. "You think your homemade lunch is so superior to how the rest of us survive our days. You think there's something profound about spending hours in a kitchen when you could be advancing your career or improving your circumstances. I think there's something profound about taking care of the people you love even in small ways." Sarah stared at him, and for a moment something flickered across her features that might have been longing, but it was gone so quickly that David wondered if he had imagined it. "People you love," she repeated softly, then seemed to catch herself. "That's a luxury not everyone can afford." "It's not a luxury, it's a choice." Sarah felt anger rising again, but this time it was directed inward as much as at him. How dare he make it sound so simple when nothing in her life had ever been simple? How dare he imply that she had chosen isolation when every decision she had made had been about survival, about proving that she could succeed in a world that had tried to convince her she was too soft, too emotional, too female to lead. "You want to talk about choices?" Sarah's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried more threat than her earlier sharp tone. "Let me tell you about choices. My mother is dying in a hospital bed 20 minutes from here, and she hasn't smiled in 6 months. 6 months of watching her waste away while doctors tell me there's nothing more they can do. 6 months of sitting beside her bed, feeling completely powerless for the first time in my adult life." David's expression softened immediately, but Sarah wasn't finished. "So here's a choice for you, since you're so confident about the power of your little kitchen magic. You think a homemade meal can fix anything. You think food is some kind of universal language that speaks to the soul." Sarah's eyes blazed with a mixture of pain and challenge. "Make my mother smile, make her eat something she actually wants instead of choking down hospital food because she has to. Do that and I'll admit that maybe there's something to your philosophy." David studied her face, seeing past the anger to the desperation underneath. "And if I can't?" Sarah's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. Then you admit that your sentimental approach to life is nothing but privileged nonsense from someone who's never faced real problems. The challenge hung between them like a bridge, neither was sure they wanted to cross. David thought about Emma, about the way she lit up when he surprised her with chocolate chip pancakes on Saturday mornings. He thought about his late wife Maria, who had taught him that feeding someone was the most basic way of saying you matter to me. And if I do manage to make her smile. Sarah hesitated, caught off guard by the question. She had expected him to back down, to recognize that she was talking about something far beyond his capabilities. Instead, he was looking at her with the same steady attention he had given his lunch, as if he were considering the challenge seriously. Then I'll marry you, Sarah said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. Because if you can do something I can't, if you can bring joy back to someone I love when all my money and connections and power have failed, then you'll have proven that your way of seeing the world is worth more than mine. The words echoed across the construction site with the finality of a gavel. Sarah immediately regretted them, recognizing that she had let her emotions drive her to make a promise that was both absurd and impossible to retract without losing face entirely. David stared at her for a long moment, then carefully tucked his lunch back into his toolbox. What's your mother's name? Margaret. Maggie. Sarah's voice was barely audible. Why? Because if I'm going to cook for her, I need to know who she is beyond being your mother. What does she like? What makes her happy when she's not sick? Sarah felt tears threatening for the first time in months, caught off guard by the gentleness in his voice. She used to love garden parties, Sunday dinners with too much food and too many people. She made the best peach cobbler in Riverside, always served it with vanilla ice cream that she insisted on making herself. David nodded as if he were taking notes. When can I meet her? You're serious. It wasn't a question, dead serious. Your mother deserves to smile, and you deserve to see her happy. The marriage part we can figure out later. Sarah looked at this man in work clothes who had just agreed to attempt what teams of specialists had failed to accomplish, and felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Hope mixed with terror in equal measure. Tomorrow, she said. Visiting hours start at 10. David extended his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Sarah shook it. His palm was rough with calluses, warm and steady in a way that made her realize how long it had been since anyone had touched her with simple human connection rather than professional necessity. I'll see you tomorrow, Sarah. The sound of her name in his voice, spoken without her title or the deference she was accustomed to, sent an unexpected shiver through her. She nodded once, then turned and walked away with as much dignity as she could manage, leaving David standing among the construction materials with the weight of an impossible promise settling on his shoulders. That evening, as Sarah sat in her corner office overlooking the city, she stared at her reflection in the darkened window, and wondered what she had done. In the space of a single conversation, she had gone from mocking a stranger's lunch to agreeing to marry him if he could accomplish something she had failed to do with all her resources. But as she thought about her mother lying in that sterile hospital room, growing smaller and more distant each day, Sarah realized that she would have promised anything for the chance to see Maggie smile one more time, even if it meant admitting that a construction worker with dusty boots and homemade lasagna might understand something about life that had eluded her entirely. 20 minutes across town, David sat at his kitchen table while Emma worked on her homework beside him, and tried to figure out how to explain to an 8-year-old that Daddy had made a very complicated promise to a very sad lady. But first, he needed to plan a meal that could somehow bridge the gap between grief and joy, between a dying woman's fading hope, and her daughter's desperate love. The challenge ahead seemed impossible, but David had learned that the most important things in life usually did. David Martinez stood in the produce section of Riverside Market at 6:30 in the morning, holding a peach in each hand like he was weighing precious stones. The fruit had to be perfect, not too soft, not too firm, with just the right blush of color that promised sweetness without the mealy texture of something picked too early. Emma stood beside him in her school clothes, backpack already strapped on, watching her father with the intense concentration she usually reserved for math homework. "Why are we buying peaches for the sick lady's mommy?" Emma asked, her voice carrying the particular clarity that 8-year-olds brought to complex situations. David set one peach back and selected another, turning it slowly in his palm, because sometimes when people are very sick, regular food doesn't taste good anymore. But if you can find the right flavor, something that reminds them of being happy, It might help them feel a little better. Emma nodded solemnly, as if this made perfect sense. Like when I had the flu and you made me that soup with the stars in it. Exactly like that. They moved through the store with purpose, David selecting ingredients with the methodical care of someone who understood that every choice mattered. Vanilla beans, not extract, because the real thing had a complexity that artificial flavoring could never match. Heavy cream from the local dairy, eggs from chickens that had names rather than numbers. Brown sugar with molasses still clinging to the crystals, imparting a depth that white sugar couldn't provide. The woman at the checkout counter, Mrs. Patterson, had known David since he'd moved to Riverside 3 years ago. She watched him arrange his purchases on the conveyor belt with the kind of attention usually reserved for diffusing bombs. Special occasion, she asked, ringing up the vanilla beans that cost more than most people spent on lunch. Trying to help someone remember what happiness tastes like, David replied, then immediately felt foolish for saying something so sentimental to someone who dealt with grocery transactions all day. But Mrs. Patterson just smiled and carefully bagged the peaches with extra padding. Those are good peaches. Mrs. Henderson picked them herself yesterday. If anyone can help someone remember happiness, it's those peaches. By 8 o'clock, David had dropped Emma at school and was standing in his small kitchen, sleeves rolled up, studying the ingredients spread across the counter like a general planning a campaign. He had called in sick to work, something he had never done for anything other than Emma's emergencies. The foreman hadn't been happy, but David had 3 years of perfect attendance to cushion the request. The cobbler had to be more than just dessert, it had to be a bridge between memory and hope. David had never met Margaret Thompson, knew nothing about her beyond the bare facts Sarah had shared and the image of a woman who loved garden parties and Sunday dinners. But he understood loss, understood the way illness could strip away not just physical strength, but the will to find joy in simple pleasures. He began with the filling, peeling each peach by hand rather than blanching them, preserving the delicate texture that would hold up during baking. The knife moved steadily through the fruit, creating uniform slices that would cook evenly and look beautiful when served. David had learned precision during his brief career in professional kitchens, but he had learned patience from being a father. As the peaches released their juice, he added just enough sugar to enhance their natural sweetness without overwhelming it. A touch of lemon juice to brighten the flavor, a hint of cinnamon and nutmeg to add warmth without competing with the fruit. The mixture needed to rest, allowing the peaches to release their juices and create the syrup that would bind everything together. While the filling macerated, David turned his attention to the topping. This was where the real magic happened, where flour and butter and sugar transformed into something greater than the sum of their parts. He cut cold butter into small cubes, working them into the flour with his fingertips until the mixture resembled coarse breadcrumbs. Too much handling would make the topping tough, too little would prevent the proper texture from developing. The vanilla ice cream required even more attention. David heated cream and milk in a heavy-bottomed saucepan, watching for the moment when tiny bubbles formed around the edges but before it reached a full boil. The vanilla beans had been split and scraped, their seeds dispersed throughout the mixture like tiny black stars. The custard base needed to be cooked slowly, stirred constantly, brought to exactly the right temperature to thicken without curdling. By 10:15, David was standing outside Margaret Thompson's hospital room with a thermal bag containing a still warm cobbler and a container of ice cream kept cold with dry ice. He had changed into his one good shirt, pressed his jeans, and combed his hair back with water because it seemed important to show respect for the gravity of the situation. Sarah was already there, sitting in a chair beside the bed, holding her mother's hand and speaking in low tones about quarterly reports and market projections. She looked up when David appeared in the doorway, and her expression shifted from surprise to something that might have been relief. Margaret Thompson was smaller than David had expected, diminished by illness but not defeated. Her silver hair was arranged neatly against the pillow, and her eyes, though tired, held an intelligence that reminded him immediately of her daughter. She turned toward the door when Sarah stopped talking, studying David with the frank curiosity of someone who had nothing left to lose by being direct. "Mama, this is David Martinez," Sarah said, her voice carefully neutral. "He's the man I told you about." Margaret's eyebrows rose slightly. "The one who made you promise to marry him if he could make me smile." David felt heat rise in his cheeks. "That's not exactly how it happened, ma'am. No, I imagine not. Sarah has a tendency to complicate simple things. Margaret's voice was weaker than David had expected, but it carried the same authority he had heard in her daughter's tone. She also said you make exceptional lasagna. I brought something different today, David said, setting the thermal bag on the rolling table beside her bed. I hope you don't mind the liberty, but Sarah mentioned you used to make peach cobbler. Margaret's expression shifted, something flickering behind her eyes that hadn't been there moments before. I haven't thought about peach cobbler in months. The doctors say my appetite isn't what it should be. David began unpacking the containers, moving slowly and deliberately. Sometimes our bodies forget what they want, but our memories remember. The aroma filled the small room as David lifted the lid from the cobbler dish. It was the smell of summer afternoons and family gatherings, of butter and cinnamon and fruit, so ripe it seemed to hold sunshine. Margaret inhaled deeply, and David watched her face transform as the scent triggered something deeper than hunger. Oh my, she whispered, tears gathering in her eyes. It smells like my kitchen used to smell on Sundays. Sarah leaned forward, watching her mother's reaction with an intensity that spoke of months of hoping for any sign of engagement with the world beyond this sterile room. David made the ice cream too, Mama. Vanilla, just like you used to make. David served the cobbler in proper portions, the golden topping giving way to reveal the tender peaches beneath, their juices having created a syrup that caught the light like amber. He added a generous scoop of ice cream to each bowl, watching it begin to melt at the edges where it touched the warm fruit. Margaret accepted the bowl with hands that trembled slightly, but her grip was firm. She lifted the spoon carefully, taking a small bite that included both cobbler and ice cream. David held his breath, aware that Sarah was doing the same, both of them waiting for some sign that his effort had been worthwhile. Margaret chewed slowly, thoughtfully, her eyes closed as she processed not just the flavors but the memories they awakened. When she opened her eyes, they were bright with unshed tears. The peaches are perfect, she said softly, not too sweet, not too tart, and the ice cream tastes like real vanilla, not that artificial nonsense they put in everything now. She took another bite, larger this time, and David saw something he hadn't expected, genuine pleasure crossing her features, not just the polite appreciation of someone trying to be gracious, but the real enjoyment of someone rediscovering something they had thought was lost forever. Sarah, Margaret said, turning to her daughter, when was the last time you had a proper dessert? Not one of those protein bars you live on, but something made with love and attention. Sarah looked uncomfortable with the question. I don't really have time for desserts, Mama. Nonsense. David, serve my daughter some cobbler. She's been sitting in this room for weeks watching me waste away, and she's forgotten that life is supposed to include sweetness. David glanced at Sarah, who looked like she might protest, but something in her mother's tone made it clear this wasn't a request. He prepared another bowl, noting the way Sarah's eyes followed his movements with the same intensity she had brought to their confrontation at the construction site. Sarah accepted the bowl reluctantly, as if dessert might interfere with her carefully maintained schedule. But when she took the first bite, David watched her expression soften in a way that made her look younger, more vulnerable than the CEO who had mocked his lunch the day before. It's good, Sarah admitted, sounding surprised by her own response. It's more than good, Margaret said, taking another spoonful. It's perfect. David, where did you learn to cook like this? David pulled up the visitor's chair, settling in as if he had been invited to stay. My wife taught me some basics, but I really learned after she died. Emma, my daughter, she needed more than just frozen dinners and takeout. So I taught myself, one meal at a time. Margaret nodded as if this made perfect sense. Cooking for someone you love changes how you approach food. It becomes less about efficiency and more about care. That's exactly right, David said, surprised by how well she had captured something he had never been able to articulate. Sarah watched this exchange with growing discomfort, recognizing that her mother was engaging with David in a way she hadn't managed despite weeks of bedside vigils. Mama, you should rest. The doctor said not to overexert yourself. The doctor says a lot of things, Margaret replied, taking another bite of cobbler. But he doesn't say anything about peach cobbler made by someone who understands that food is love made tangible. She turned back to David, studying him with the kind of attention she usually reserved for quarterly earnings reports. Tell me about your daughter, Emma, was it? David's face lit up in a way that transformed his features. She's 8, smart as a whip, curious about everything. She helped me pick out the peaches this morning, said they had to be perfect for the sick lady's mommy. Margaret laughed, the sound surprising everyone in the room including herself. She sounds wonderful. What does she want to be when she grows up? Changes every week. Last week it was a veterinarian, this week it's an astronaut. She's decided she wants to open a restaurant on the moon. A practical goal, Margaret said, her eyes twinkling. The competition would be minimal. Sarah stared at her mother, watching her laugh and joke with a stranger while she finished an entire bowl of cobbler. It was the most food Margaret had eaten voluntarily in weeks, and certainly the most animated she had been since the diagnosis. David, Margaret said, setting down her empty bowl, I need to ask you something serious. Yes, ma'am. Did my daughter really promise to marry you if you could make me smile? David glanced at Sarah, who looked like she wanted to disappear into the hospital floor. She did, but I think she was upset and probably didn't mean it literally. Margaret considered this for a moment. Sarah, is this man married? No, Mama. Does he seem like a good father? From what I can tell, yes. Can he cook better than anyone you've ever met? Sarah hesitated. The cobbler is excellent. Has he been kind to you even when you were unkind to him? Another hesitation. Yes. Margaret smiled, and it was the first genuine smile Sarah had seen from her mother in months. Then I think you should marry him. Mama. What? You made a promise, and he kept his end of the bargain. I'm smiling, aren't I? In fact, I'm happier than I've been since this whole nightmare started. Margaret reached for David's hand, squeezing it with surprising strength. You gave me something I thought I'd lost forever. You reminded me that there's still beauty in the world, still reasons to be grateful.
David felt tears threatening and had to clear his throat before he could speak. Mrs. Thompson, you don't need to thank me. Seeing you enjoy the cobbler is thanks enough. Call me Maggie, she said firmly. And yes, I do need to thank you. More than that, I need to tell my stubborn daughter that sometimes the most important things in life come from the most unexpected places. Sarah sat in stunned silence, watching her mother hold hands with a man she had met 24 hours ago, seeing more life in Maggie's eyes than had been there in months. The rational part of her mind insisted this was temporary, that illness and medication might be affecting her mother's judgment. But another part of her, a part she had carefully suppressed for years, recognized something true in the connection between David and her mother. Mama, you can't be serious about the marriage thing. Why not? You're 32 years old, you work 80 hours a week, and the last time you brought a man home was 3 years ago, and that was only because your assistant threatened to quit if you didn't attend the company holiday party. Maggie turned back to David. Do you work 80 hours a week? No, ma'am. I work 40 hours and spend the rest of my time with my daughter. See, he has priorities in the right order. Maggie looked back at Sarah. When was the last time you did something just because it might make someone happy? Sarah opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again, realizing she couldn't remember. Every decision she made was filtered through cost-benefit analysis, market impact, and competitive advantage. The idea of doing something purely for the joy it might bring seemed as foreign as speaking a language she had never learned. I run a company, Mama. I have responsibilities. So does David. He has a daughter who depends on him, and he still found time to spend his morning making cobbler for a dying woman he'd never met. Maggie's voice grew softer. Sarah, honey, I know you think you're protecting yourself by keeping everyone at a distance, but life is short, and it's shorter when you're sick. Don't waste it being afraid of letting people matter to you. David stood up slowly, recognizing that this conversation had moved beyond anything he had intended when he accepted Sarah's challenge. Mrs. Thompson, Maggie, I should probably go. I'm glad you enjoyed the cobbler. You're not going anywhere, Maggie said firmly. Sarah, walk this man to the cafeteria and buy him a proper lunch. Talk to him like he's a human being instead of a problem to be solved. Sarah looked like she might protest, but something in her mother's expression brooked no argument. Fine. But this doesn't mean anything about the marriage promise. Of course not, dear, Maggie said with a smile that suggested she thought it meant exactly that. Just two people having lunch and getting to know each other. As they walked toward the elevator, Sarah stole glances at David, trying to reconcile the man who had just brought her mother back to life with her preconceptions about construction workers and single fathers. He moved with quiet confidence,
holding doors without making a show of it, nodding politely to hospital staff they passed in the hallways. "Thank you," Sarah said quietly as they waited for the elevator. "I haven't seen her that happy in months. She's an amazing woman. I can see where you get your strength." Sarah felt something crack open in her chest, a warmth she wasn't prepared for. "I'm not strong, I'm just stubborn. Sometimes that's the same thing." The elevator arrived, and as they stepped inside, Sarah found herself wondering when she had last spent an hour talking to someone about something other than work. The answer frightened her almost as much as the promise she had made to a stranger who was rapidly becoming something more complicated than she knew how to handle. The hospital cafeteria buzzed with the controlled chaos of shift changes and visiting hours, fluorescent lights casting everything in the kind of harsh illumination that made even healthy people look pale. Sarah led David to a corner table, away from the main traffic flow, and sat across from him with the rigid posture of someone conducting a business meeting. She had purchased a wilted salad and black coffee, while David had chosen the soup of the day and a sandwich that looked like it had been assembled by someone who viewed food as fuel rather than nourishment. So Sarah began, then stopped, realizing she had no idea how to have a conversation that wasn't about quarterly projections or market strategies. "Tell me about your daughter." David's entire demeanor shifted at the mention of Emma, his shoulders relaxing as he pulled out his phone to show Sarah a photo. The little girl had dark curls and her father's serious eyes, but her smile was pure sunshine. She was standing in what appeared to be their small kitchen, flour dusting her apron and her cheeks, holding up a wooden spoon like a trophy. "She insisted on helping me make cookies last weekend," David said, his voice warm with affection. "Turned our kitchen into what looked like a flour bomb had gone off, but she was so proud of the results." Sarah studied the photo, trying to remember the last time she had smiled with such uncomplicated joy. "She looks happy. She is most of the time. It took a while after her mother died, but kids are resilient in ways adults forget how to be." The casual mention of his wife's death made Sarah pause. She had built her entire adult life around avoiding the kind of vulnerability that loss required, yet David spoke about it with the matter-of-fact acceptance of someone who had learned to carry grief without letting it crush him. "How did she die?" Sarah asked, then immediately regretted the question. "I'm sorry, that's too personal." "It's okay. Car accident 3 years ago. Drunk driver ran a red light." David stirred his soup absently, the pain still visible in his expression but no longer raw. "Maria was coming home from her book club. Emma was with my sister that night, which probably saved her life." Sarah felt something twist in her stomach, a recognition of how quickly everything could change. "I can't imagine losing someone that suddenly. You're losing your mother slowly, which might be worse. At least with sudden loss, you don't have to watch them suffer." The observation was gentle but penetrating, and Sarah found herself nodding despite her usual reluctance to acknowledge emotional truths. "The doctors keep talking about quality time and making memories, but she's in pain most days. I sit there reading her business reports because I don't know what else to talk about." "What did you used to talk about, before she got sick?" Sarah stabbed at her salad, buying time to think. "Work, mostly. She founded the company, you know. Started it in our garage when I was in high school. I grew up thinking that success was the most important thing you could achieve." "What did she think about that?" "She encouraged it. Pushed me to be better, stronger, more competitive." Sarah paused, a memory surfacing unbidden. "Although she used to say that I was forgetting to live while I was so busy trying to win." David nodded as if this made perfect sense. "Sounds like she wanted you to have both." "Both what?" "Success and happiness, achievement and connection. Most people think they have to choose, but maybe the real skill is figuring out how to have both." Sarah looked at him across the plastic table, this man in work clothes, who had somehow managed to make her terminally ill mother laugh while balancing single parenthood and a demanding job. "Is that what you figured out?" "I'm still learning. Some days I feel like I'm barely keeping my head above water, but Emma keeps me grounded, reminds me what actually matters." "Which is?" David considered the question seriously. "Being present, showing up completely for the people who depend on you, making sure that the last thing they remember about each day is that they're loved." Sarah felt tears threatening and looked away, focusing on the institutional beige walls rather than meeting his eyes. "I don't think I know how to do that." "Sure you do. You've been sitting in that hospital room for weeks. That's showing up. But I'm not making her happy. I'm just there. Sometimes just being there is enough. But maybe you could try being there differently." Sarah looked back at him, curious despite herself. What do you mean? Stop trying to manage her illness, and start trying to connect with who she still is underneath it. You said she used to love garden parties and Sunday dinners. What else did she love? Sarah's mind went blank for a moment, and she realized with growing horror that she couldn't immediately answer. Her relationship with her mother had become so focused on business, and later on medical management, that she had lost track of Maggie as a person rather than a patient or a mentor. She loved to dance, Sarah said finally, the memory emerging like sunlight through clouds. Before the divorce, when I was little, she and my father would dance in the kitchen while dinner was cooking. She said it was important to find joy in ordinary moments. When did they stop dancing? When the company started taking off. Dad said she was spending too much time at work, not enough time at home. She said he didn't understand what it took to build something from nothing. Sarah's voice grew bitter. Turns out they were both right, and it cost them everything. David was quiet for a moment, processing the pain behind her words. Is that why you're afraid of the marriage promise? Because you've seen how love can fall apart when people have different priorities? Sarah was startled by the directness of the question, but found herself answering honestly. I've seen how love can become another thing you fail at if you're not careful. It's easier to avoid it entirely. Easier maybe, but not necessarily better, says the man whose wife died in a car accident. David flinched slightly but didn't look away. Maria and I had 3 wonderful years together. Emma has a mother who loved her completely for the first 5 years of her life. Yes, it ended badly, but that doesn't make what we had less real or less valuable. Sarah stared at him, trying to understand how someone could view devastating loss through such a lens of gratitude. How do you do that? How do you focus on what you had instead of what you lost? Because focusing on the loss doesn't bring them back, but remembering the love keeps them alive in a different way. David pushed his half-eaten sandwich aside and leaned forward. Sarah, your mother is still here. You still have time to dance in the kitchen with her. Metaphorically speaking, she can barely walk. Then bring the dancing to her. Bring music. Bring stories. Bring the parts of life that made her happy before illness became the only thing you talked about. Sarah felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of the tight control she had maintained for so long. I wouldn't know where to start. Start with today. Go back up there and ask her about the garden parties. Ask her what kind of music she used to dance to. Stop managing her dying and start celebrating her living. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow, not because they were harsh, but because they were true. She had been so focused on fighting her mother's illness, that she had forgotten to enjoy her mother's presence. What if it's too late? What if we've lost too much time? Then you start with whatever time you have left. Sarah's phone buzzed with an urgent message from her assistant about a conference call she was supposed to join, but for the first time in her professional life, she silenced it without reading the details. David, can I ask you something? Of course. Yesterday, when I mocked your lunch, you could have just walked away. You could have reported me to my own HR department. Why did you engage with me instead? David smiled, and it transformed his entire face. Because you reminded me of myself right after Maria died, angry at the world, trying to control everything because you can't control the one thing that matters most. I recognized the pain underneath the aggression, and you thought insulting your lasagna was a cry for help. I thought it was a woman who had forgotten that she deserves gentleness, even from herself. Sarah felt her carefully constructed walls beginning to crumble, and the sensation was both terrifying and liberating. The marriage promise was insane. You know that, right? Completely insane, David agreed cheerfully. But it got your mother to smile, and it got us talking. Sometimes insane is exactly what a situation needs. You're not actually expecting me to follow through with it. David studied her face carefully, as if he were trying to read something written in a language he was still learning. I'm not expecting anything, but I'm not dismissing it either. Yesterday you were a stranger who seemed to think kindness was a weakness. Today you're a woman who's been taking care of her dying mother while running a company and forgetting to take care of herself. Tomorrow you might be someone entirely different. People don't change that quickly, don't they? 24 hours ago, did you think you'd be sitting in a hospital cafeteria talking about dancing in kitchens with a construction worker? Sarah had to admit he had a point. This is all happening too fast. Then we slow it down. No pressure, no expectations. Just 2 people who care about making your mother happy for whatever time she has left. And the marriage thing, gets filed under things to revisit when we're not sitting in a hospital cafeteria. Sarah laughed despite herself, surprised by the sound of her own amusement. You're very practical for someone who makes marriage proposals to strangers. I'm very practical because I make marriage proposals to strangers. Someone has to think these things through. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the background noise of the cafeteria fading, as Sarah processed everything that had changed in the span of 2 days. She thought about her mother upstairs, probably wondering why they were taking so long. She thought about the conference call she was missing, and realized she didn't care as much as she should. Most of all, she thought about the man sitting across from her, who had somehow managed to crack open her world with peach cobbler and genuine kindness. David, there's something I need to tell you about my mother. Okay. The doctors say she has maybe 6 weeks left, 8 at the outside. Sarah's voice caught slightly. If you're thinking about getting involved with this family, you should know that there's not going to be a happy ending where she gets better. David reached across the table and covered her hand with his, the contact warm and steady. Sarah, there are different kinds of happy endings. Maybe the happy ending isn't your mother getting well. Maybe it's your mother spending her last weeks feeling loved and remembered and celebrated instead of just managed. And what about after? What happens to this, whatever this is, when she's gone?
I don't know, David said honestly.
But I know that running away from connection because it might hurt later is no way to live. Emma taught me that. She could have decided never to love anyone again after losing her mother, but instead she loves bigger and braver than most adults. Sarah turned her hand over, palm up, so that David was holding it properly rather than just covering it. The gesture felt enormous, like stepping off a cliff she hadn't known she was standing on.
I don't know how to do this, she whispered. I don't know how to be someone who lets people matter.
Then we figure it out together, one meal at a time, one conversation at a time, one day at a time. Sarah's phone buzzed again, more insistently this time, but she didn't even glance at it. For the first time in her adult life, something mattered more than the urgent demands of her professional world. We should go back upstairs, she said finally. Mom is probably wondering what happened to us, probably planning our wedding menu. David agreed, and Sarah laughed again, the sound coming easier this time. As they stood to leave, Sarah realized she felt different than she had that morning, lighter somehow, as if she had been carrying a weight she hadn't known was there until David had helped her set it down. It was a dangerous feeling, this lightness, because it made her want things she had convinced herself were impossible. But as they walked back toward the elevators, David's presence steady and unhurried beside her, Sarah decided that maybe impossible was just another word for something that required more courage than she had previously been willing to summon. The elevator doors opened, and as they stepped inside, Sarah caught their reflection in the polished metal. They looked like two people who belonged together, which was either the most hopeful thing she had seen in months or the most terrifying. She decided as the elevator climbed toward her mother's floor, that it was probably both. When they returned to Margaret's room, they found her sitting up straighter than she had in weeks, her color improved, and her eyes bright with an energy that hadn't been there that morning. She was speaking animatedly with a nurse about the proper way to prepare vanilla ice cream, gesturing with hands that no longer seemed quite so fragile. "There you are," Margaret said as Sarah and David entered. "I was just telling Jenny here about David's ice cream. Apparently her grandmother used to make it the same way, with real vanilla beans." The nurse, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and graying hair, smiled at David. "Mrs. Thompson says you're some kind of miracle worker in the kitchen." David felt heat rise in his cheeks. "Just someone who pays attention to details." "Don't let him fool you," Margaret interjected. "This man made me remember what it feels like to anticipate something good instead of just enduring whatever comes next." Sarah watched this exchange with growing amazement. In the space of a few hours, her mother had transformed from a passive patient into someone actively engaging with the world around her. The change was so dramatic that Sarah wondered if she had been underestimating her mother's capacity for resilience. "Mama, how are you feeling? You look better." "I feel better, not physically necessarily," but Margaret paused, searching for the right words. "I feel like myself again, like Margaret Thompson instead of just patient 347B."
David settled back into the visitor's chair as if he had been invited to stay permanently. What did you like most about those garden parties you used to throw? Margaret's face lit up with the question. Oh, everything. Planning the menu, arranging the flowers, watching people relax and connect with each other. I loved creating a space where everyone felt welcome and valued. What kind of food did you serve? Simple things mostly. Fresh bread, seasonal salads, things that tasted like summer, and always something sweet at the end. I believed that every gathering should end with sweetness, something to send people home with a good taste in their mouths. Sarah listened to her mother describe these parties with growing sadness, realizing she had never really understood what they meant to Margaret. She had dismissed them as frivolous social obligations, not recognizing them as expressions of her mother's fundamental belief in the importance of bringing people together. When was the last time you had a garden party? David asked. Margaret's expression grew wistful. 3 years ago, right before the diagnosis. Sarah was so busy with work that she couldn't attend, and her father. She trailed off, old pain flickering across her features. I'm sorry I missed it, Sarah said quietly, meaning it in a way she hadn't been able to express when the invitation was first extended. You were building the company, honey. I understood. But David heard something in Margaret's tone that suggested understanding and being hurt were not mutually exclusive. What would a hospital garden party look like? He asked thoughtfully. Margaret tilted her head, intrigued by the question. What do you mean? Well, you can't have people over to your house right now, but that doesn't mean you can't create that same feeling of connection and celebration here. What if we brought the garden party to you? Sarah looked at David as if he had suggested they redecorate the hospital room with live elephants. David, there are rules about food in patient rooms, not to mention visitor restrictions and medical protocols. There are also rules about giving up on joy because it's inconvenient, Margaret said firmly. David, what are you thinking? David leaned forward, his voice taking on the enthusiasm of someone developing a plan in real time. Nothing elaborate. Just a few people who care about you, some good food, maybe some music. We could work with the nursing staff to make sure everything is safe and appropriate. The nurses would never allow it, Sarah protested, but she could see her mother's eyes beginning to shine with possibility. Actually, Jenny the nurse interjected from the doorway where she had been quietly listening. We encourage patients to maintain social connections when possible, as long as we keep the group small and follow basic hygiene protocols. I don't see why it wouldn't be allowed. Margaret clapped her hands together with more energy than she had shown in months. Sarah, what do you think? Could we invite a few friends? Maybe James and Patricia from the book club, and your assistant Rebecca if she's free. Sarah felt the familiar weight of logistics and responsibility settling on her shoulders. Mama, I would need to coordinate schedules, find a way to get appropriate food, figure out the medical considerations. I could handle the food, David offered quietly. 3 days later, David stood in the hospital parking lot at 5 in the morning, loading insulated containers and folding tables into the back of his borrowed pickup truck. The sun was just beginning to edge over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that reminded him of the peach cobbler that had started this entire unexpected journey. Emma sat in the passenger seat, still in her pajamas, but wide awake with excitement about what she called the hospital picnic. The past 72 hours had been a whirlwind of planning that felt more like orchestrating a military operation than organizing a simple gathering. Sarah had thrown herself into the logistics with the same intensity she brought to corporate acquisitions, making calls to coordinate guest schedules, and somehow managing to secure permission from hospital administration for what they were calling a therapeutic social gathering. David had spent those same 3 days in his kitchen, preparing food that would travel well and serve a group of people he had never met but who meant the world to the woman he was rapidly discovering meant more to him than he had thought possible. The menu had been carefully considered, each dish chosen for its ability to evoke comfort and connection without overwhelming someone whose appetite had been compromised by months of treatment. Daddy, do you think the sick lady will like the soup? Emma asked as they pulled into the hospital parking garage. I think she'll love it, David replied, though he felt the familiar flutter of anxiety that came with cooking for people whose approval mattered. Remember what we talked about. Be polite, don't touch anything in the hospital room, and if someone looks sad, offer them a cookie. David smiled at his daughter's interpretation of hospital etiquette. Close enough. They made their way through the early morning corridors, past shift changes, and the quiet bustle of a medical facility that never truly slept. David had become familiar with these hallways over the past few days, arriving each morning with breakfast for Margaret and staying long enough to ensure she ate more than just a few bites. What had started as fulfilling a challenge had evolved into something that felt suspiciously like family obligation. Margaret's room had been transformed overnight. Sarah had somehow procured additional chairs, a small sound system, and fresh flowers that filled the space with the scent of summer despite the sterile hospital environment. Margaret herself looked more alive than David had yet seen her, wearing a soft blue cardigan that brought out her eyes and sitting up in bed with an alertness that spoke of genuine anticipation. "David," she called out as he entered with the first load of containers, "and this must be the famous Emma." Emma moved forward shyly, clutching a hand-drawn card she had made the night before. "I made this for you, Mrs. Margaret. Daddy said you like flowers." Margaret accepted the card with the reverence usually reserved for priceless artifacts, studying Emma's crayon drawing of what appeared to be a garden filled with impossibly large sunflowers and a stick figure woman with a crown. "This is the most beautiful thing I've seen in months. Look, Sarah, isn't this lovely?" Sarah, who had arrived 20 minutes earlier with coffee and dark circles under her eyes that spoke of another sleepless night spent alternately planning the gathering and questioning her sanity, looked up from her phone long enough to smile at Emma's artwork. "It's perfect, sweetheart." Over the next hour the room filled with people who clearly cared deeply about Margaret Thompson. James and Patricia from the book club arrived bearing stories and laughter, their easy familiarity with Margaret creating an atmosphere of warmth that seemed to push back against the clinical coldness of the hospital setting. Rebecca, Sarah's assistant, brought flowers and the kind of gentle competence that made her invaluable in both professional and personal crises. David worked quietly in the background, setting up the food service with the help of Jenny and 2 other nurses who had volunteered their break time to assist. He had prepared butternut squash soup enriched with cream and fresh herbs, crusty bread that filled the room with the scent of yeast and warmth, a salad of mixed greens with pomegranate seeds that looked like scattered jewels, and individual portions of lemon posset that would dissolve on the tongue like sweet clouds. "David, this is incredible," Patricia said as she accepted a bowl of soup. "Margaret told us you were talented, but this is restaurant quality. Better than restaurant quality," James added after tasting the bread. "This has love in it." Emma had positioned herself near Margaret's bed, chattering about school and her friends and her recent decision that she wanted to learn to cook like her daddy. Margaret listened with the focused attention of someone who understood that children's stories were windows into worlds of possibility that adults often forgot existed. "Emma, do you know what my favorite thing about cooking is?" Margaret asked during a pause in the 8-year-old's enthusiastic monologue. "What?" "It's the only magic that gets better when you share it. When you cook for someone you care about, the food tastes better than when you cook just for yourself." Emma considered this with the seriousness she brought to all new information. "Is that why Daddy's food always tastes extra good? Because he makes it for me?" "Exactly." Sarah watched this exchange from across the room, feeling something shift inside her chest as she observed her mother's interaction with David's daughter. There was an ease between them that spoke of natural affection, the kind of instant connection that couldn't be forced or manufactured. It was the same ease she had noticed between David and her mother, a recognition of shared values and complementary spirits. "Sarah, come sit with us," Margaret called, patting the side of her bed. "You've been hovering by that window for 10 minutes. Sarah joined the group reluctantly, still holding her phone in case urgent business demanded her attention. But as she settled into the chair beside her mother's bed, she found herself drawn into the gentle rhythm of conversation that flowed around shared food and mutual affection. "Margaret, remember the summer you decided to teach Sarah how to make jam?" Patricia asked, laughing at a memory that made Margaret's eyes light up. "Oh, that was a disaster," Margaret said, reaching over to squeeze Sarah's hand. "She was 14 and convinced she could improve my recipe with more scientific precision." Spent an hour calculating the exact sugar-to-fruit ratio and ended up with something that could have been used to repair roads. It wasn't that bad, Sarah protested, but she was smiling at the memory. It was exactly that bad, Margaret replied fondly. But you ate it anyway every morning on your toast because you were too proud to admit the experiment had failed. David listened to these stories with the fascination of someone learning the mythology of a family that was rapidly becoming important to him. He watched Sarah's face soften as her mother recounted memories of their life together, seeing glimpses of the woman she might have been if
circumstances had allowed her to prioritize connection over achievement. What about you, David? James asked. Do you have any cooking disasters to share? David grinned, settling back in his chair with Emma curled against his side. The first time I tried to make birthday cake for Emma after Maria died, I confused salt for sugar in the frosting. She took one bite, made the most awful face, and then very politely asked if we could order pizza instead. But you kept trying, Margaret observed. I kept trying. Emma deserved homemade birthday cakes, even if it took me 6 attempts to get it right. And now he makes the best chocolate cake in the whole world, Emma added loyally. As the afternoon progressed, David noticed that Margaret was eating more than she had during any of his previous visits, not just picking at her food out of politeness, but actually savoring each bite and asking for seconds of the lemon posset. The transformation was remarkable, as if the presence of people who loved her had somehow restored her appetite along with her spirits. This is exactly what I needed, Margaret said as the gathering began to wind down. Not just the food though, David, you've outdone yourself, but this feeling of being surrounded by people who see me as more than just my diagnosis. Sarah felt tears threatening as she watched her mother's face, radiant with happiness despite the obvious fatigue that was beginning to set in. Mama, we should probably let you rest. Not yet, Margaret said, reaching for David's hand. I want to tell you all something while we're together like this. The room grew quiet, everyone sensing that Margaret had something important to share. I've been thinking a lot lately about legacy, about what we leave behind when we're gone. I used to think it was the company, the business success, the tangible achievements that could be measured and quantified. She looked directly at Sarah. But sitting here today, surrounded by people who care about each other and sharing food made with love, I realize that the real legacy is connection. It's the relationships we build and the kindness we share and the way we make each other feel valued. David felt the weight of her words settle over the room like a blessing. David, you gave me something I thought I had lost forever. Not just the appetite for food, but the appetite for life. You reminded me that there's still beauty to be created and shared, even when circumstances seem impossible. Mrs. Thompson, let me finish, Margaret said gently. Sarah, you've spent your whole adult life trying to honor what you thought I wanted for you. But what I really want is for you to understand that success without connection is just elaborate loneliness. Sarah looked down at her hands, struggling with emotions she usually kept carefully contained. And Emma, Margaret continued, turning to the little girl who had been listening with the solemnity children brought to important adult conversations, you have a daddy who understands that the most important ingredient in any recipe is love. Don't ever let anyone convince you that practical things matter more than taking care of each other. Emma nodded seriously, then climbed onto Margaret's bed and gave her a careful hug. I think you're very nice, Mrs. Margaret. I hope you feel better soon. Margaret held the child close, tears flowing freely now. You've already made me feel better, sweetheart. As the guests began to gather their things and prepare to leave, David found himself lingering in the room, reluctant to end what felt like a perfect afternoon. He had watched Sarah gradually relax throughout the gathering, seen her laugh at her mother's stories, and engage with the other guests in ways that revealed glimpses of the woman she might be if she allowed herself to prioritize joy along with achievement. David, could you stay for a few minutes? Margaret asked as the others filed out with promises to return soon. Sarah looked uncertain, glancing between her mother and David as if trying to read a situation that had moved beyond her ability to control or predict. Sarah, you stay too. I want to talk to both of you. When the room had cleared except for the three of them and Emma, who had fallen asleep in one of the chairs with her head pillowed on her coat, Margaret took a deep breath and looked directly at her daughter. Sarah, I need you to listen to me very carefully. I don't have long, and I want to make sure you understand something important. Mama, please don't hush. This isn't about being morbid, it's about being practical. You've spent your entire adult life building walls to protect yourself from exactly the kind of vulnerability you're feeling right now. But those walls haven't protected you from pain, they've just isolated you from joy. Margaret turned to include David in her gaze. David, I don't know what's happening between you and my daughter, but I can see that you care about her. More than that, I can see that she's beginning to care about you, which terrifies her. Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks. Mama, this is hardly the time. This is exactly the time. When you're dying, you get very clear about what matters and what doesn't. What matters is that you found someone who sees your strength but isn't intimidated by it, who challenges you to be better without trying to diminish who you are. David felt the weight of Margaret's words and the responsibility they implied. Mrs. Thompson, I care about Sarah very much, but I don't want to pressure her into anything she's not ready for, and that's exactly why you're right for her. Sarah has spent her whole life around people who wanted something from her. You're the first person I've seen who seems to want something for her. Sarah looked between her mother and David, feeling simultaneously exposed and protected in a way she couldn't quite articulate. I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to be someone who lets people matter without losing everything I've worked for. You don't have to choose, Margaret said firmly. You can be successful and connected, driven and loving, independent and partnered. But you have to be willing to believe that you deserve both. David reached across the space between their chairs and took Sarah's hand, the gesture natural and unforced. Sarah, I'm not asking you to give up anything that makes you who you are. I'm just asking you to consider adding something that might make you happier. Sarah looked down at their joined hands, surprised by how right it felt to be anchored by his touch. The marriage promise was crazy. Completely crazy, David agreed. But crazy doesn't always mean wrong. Margaret smiled, watching her daughter wrestle with possibilities she had never allowed herself to consider. Sarah, what scares you most about this? Sarah was quiet for a long moment, considering the question seriously. Failing, disappointing you, proving that I'm not capable of balancing everything, losing myself in someone else's expectations. And what scares you most about not trying? Another pause, longer this time, spending the rest of my life wondering what might have happened if I had been brave enough to find out. David squeezed her hand gently. Then maybe we start with small steps. No pressure, no timeline, just two people getting to know each other and seeing what develops. And Emma comes with me obviously. But she already likes you, which is usually the hardest part. Sarah glanced over at the sleeping child, remembering the way Emma had hugged her when she arrived that morning, the same uncomplicated affection she had shown Margaret. What if I'm terrible at this? What if I don't know how to be around children, or how to be part of a family? Then we figure it out together, David said simply. That's what families do. Margaret settled back against her pillows, satisfied with what she was seeing between them. David, I want you to promise me something, anything. Promise me that you won't let my daughter's fear of vulnerability sabotage something that could make her genuinely happy. She's going to try to logic her way out of this because feelings can't be controlled or quantified. Don't let her. David looked at Sarah, seeing the conflict playing out across her features. I promise. But Sarah has to make her own choices. I can't force someone to let me love them. No, but you can be patient while they learn how to let themselves be loved. Sarah felt something crack open in her chest, a warm flood of possibility mixed with terror. I can't promise anything right now except that I want to try. That's enough, Margaret said, her voice growing drowsy as the excitement of the day began to catch up with her. That's more than enough to start with. As Margaret drifted off to sleep, David and Sarah sat in comfortable silence, still holding hands, watching the woman who had somehow managed to orchestrate a connection neither of them had seen coming. Outside the window, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of hope and uncertainty that seemed to mirror everything Sarah was feeling about the future. 2 weeks later, Margaret Thompson died peacefully in her sleep on a Tuesday morning, when the cherry blossoms outside her hospital window were in full bloom. Sarah received the call at 6:30, while she was reviewing quarterly projections, and for the first time in her professional life, she hung up on a conference call without explanation, and drove straight to the hospital through streets, blurred by tears she didn't try to stop. David was already there when she arrived, sitting beside the empty bed with Emma curled in his lap, both of them quiet in the way that grief demanded. He had brought Margaret breakfast every morning for the past 14 days, and this morning the nurses had called him when they realized she was gone. Sarah had become his emergency contact without either of them discussing it, a practical arrangement that had evolved into something much more significant. I'm sorry I wasn't here, Sarah whispered, sinking into the chair she had occupied for so many hours over the past months. She knew you loved her, David said simply. That's what mattered. Sarah looked at her mother's peaceful face, finally free from the pain that had shadowed her final months, and felt a complex mixture of grief and gratitude. Margaret had gotten her garden party, had spent her last week surrounded by laughter and good food, and people who celebrated her life rather than just managing her death. In the end, that felt like the greatest gift Sarah could have given her. Emma stirred in David's arms, lifting her head to look at Sarah with the serious expression she wore when processing difficult emotions. "Miss Sarah, is Mrs. Margaret in heaven now?" Sarah struggled to find words that would be honest without being frightening. "I think she's wherever people go when they've lived a life full of love and kindness." "That sounds like heaven to me," Emma said, then climbed down from her father's lap, and moved to Sarah's chair, wrapping her small arms around Sarah's waist. "Are you very sad?" "Very sad," Sarah confirmed, holding the child close, and finding unexpected comfort in Emma's uncomplicated affection. "Daddy says it's okay to be sad when people we love go away, as long as we remember the happy parts too." Sarah looked over Emma's head at David, seeing her own grief reflected in his eyes along with something else, something that spoke of shared experience and mutual understanding. He had held vigil with her through Margaret's decline, had witnessed her gradual transformation from a woman who managed emotions to someone who finally allowed herself to feel them fully. The funeral 3 days later was exactly what Margaret would have wanted. Instead of a somber affair focused on loss, it became a celebration of a life well lived and relationships well tended. Sarah spoke about her mother's business acumen and pioneering spirit, but also about her belief that success meant nothing without people to share it with. David, at Sarah's request, provided the reception meal, creating a feast that brought together Margaret's diverse community of friends and colleagues around tables filled with the kind of food that encouraged lingering and connection. Emma moved through the gathering like a small ambassador of comfort, offering tissues to crying adults and sharing stories about Mrs. Margaret's smile that made everyone remember why they were celebrating rather than just mourning. Sarah watched her navigate the crowd with the same natural grace Margaret had possessed, and felt a deep certainty that her mother would have been proud of the way her death was being honored. "Your mother raised an incredible woman," James from the book club told David as they cleaned up after the last guests had departed. "Sarah's lucky to have found someone who sees her clearly." "I'm the lucky one," David replied, watching Sarah direct the catering staff with the same efficiency she brought to board meetings, but with a gentleness that was new since Margaret's death had forced her to confront her own capacity for vulnerability. That evening, after Emma had been settled at Rose's house for the night and the last of the funeral arrangements had been finalized, Sarah and David found themselves alone in Margaret's house for the first time. Sarah had inherited the property along with the responsibility of deciding what to do with a lifetime's worth of accumulated memories and possessions. They walked through rooms filled with furniture that told stories, walls covered with photographs that chronicled decades of family history, kitchen cupboards stocked with recipes written in Margaret's careful handwriting. Sarah moved through the space like someone revisiting a foreign country she had once known intimately, touching objects that triggered memories she had forgotten she possessed. "She kept everything," Sarah said, opening a closet to reveal boxes of school reports and art projects and letters Sarah had written from college. "I never realized how much of my life she held on to." David found her in Margaret's bedroom an hour later, sitting on the floor surrounded by photo albums and scrapbooks, tears streaming down her face as she studied pictures of birthday parties and Christmas mornings and ordinary Tuesday afternoons that had been preserved because someone had recognized their significance. "Look at this," Sarah said, holding up a photograph of herself at age 6, flower in her hair and frosting on her cheek, standing beside a lopsided birthday cake. "I remember thinking I had ruined everything because the layers weren't even. But she took a picture because she said the best cakes were the ones made with enthusiasm instead of perfection." David sat down beside her on the carpet, studying the photo of a little girl who already showed signs of the perfectionism that would both drive and limit her adult life. "She was teaching you something important. I know that now. I wish I had understood it then." They spent the night going through boxes and sharing stories, David learning about Sarah's childhood, while Sarah rediscovered parts of herself she had abandoned in her pursuit of professional success. By morning, the house felt less like a museum, and more like a bridge between the woman Sarah had been and the woman she was becoming. "I want to keep the recipe collection," Sarah said as they packed the final boxes, "and the garden tools. Maybe I'll try growing something." "Emma would love to help you plant a garden," David offered. "She's been asking if we can grow our own vegetables." Sarah paused in her packing, struck by the casual way David had included her in his future plans with Emma. Over the past month the three of them had fallen into a routine that felt suspiciously like family, sharing meals and homework supervision and bedtime stories with an ease that surprised everyone involved. "David, we need to talk about what happens next." He looked up from the box of photographs he was sealing. "What do you mean?" "I mean we've been living in a bubble for the past month, focused on taking care of my mother and getting through her death. But now we have to figure out what this actually is between us." David set down the packing tape and gave her his full attention. "What do you want it to be?" Sarah struggled with the question, caught between her ingrained habit of analyzing everything and her growing desire to simply trust what felt right. "I want to try. Really try, not just going through the motions until one of us gets scared and runs away." "What would really trying look like?" "I don't know. I've never done this before." Sarah sat down on Margaret's bed, suddenly exhausted by the weight of so much change in such a short period. "I know I want to spend time with you and Emma. I know I want to learn how to cook more than just coffee and microwave meals. I know I want to be someone who creates connection instead of just managing transactions." David joined her on the bed, close enough that their shoulders touched. "Those all sound like good starting points. But I also know I can't just abandon everything I've built. The company needs me, and I'm not ready to stop being someone who accomplishes things in the world. I wouldn't want you to. Emma needs to see that women can be strong and successful and independent. But maybe you could also show her that success doesn't have to mean isolation." Sarah leaned into him slightly, allowing herself to take comfort in his solid presence. "The marriage promise. Still the craziest thing either of us has ever agreed to," David finished. "But maybe crazy was exactly what we both needed." "Are you proposing to me?" "I'm suggesting that we stop overthinking something that feels right and start building something together. Emma, you, me, whatever that looks like." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, processing the magnitude of what he was offering. Not just romance but partnership. Not just love but family. Not just someone to share her bed, but someone to share her life with all its complexities and responsibilities. "I'll probably be terrible at this sometimes. I'll work too much and forget to ask how your day was and try to solve problems that just need to be listened to. And I'll probably leave dishes in the sink and track mud through your house and worry too much about whether Emma is eating enough vegetables." "Sounds like we're perfect for each other," Sarah said, and meant it. 6 months later, Sarah stood in the kitchen of the house she now shared with David and Emma, attempting to prepare dinner while Emma provided running commentary on proper seasoning techniques, and David supervised from the breakfast bar with a mixture of amusement and gentle encouragement. "More salt, Miss Sarah," Emma instructed seriously. "Daddy says you can't taste the love if you can't taste the food." Sarah added salt to the pasta sauce, still amazed by how natural this domestic routine had become. She had sold her downtown condo and moved into David's modest home, transforming the basement into a home office where she could work remotely 3 days a week while maintaining her role as CEO. The compromise had been easier than she expected, partly because modern technology made remote work feasible, but mostly because she had discovered that she was more productive when she had reasons to finish work at reasonable hours. "How does it taste now?" Sarah asked, offering Emma a spoon to sample. Emma considered the sauce with the gravity of a professional critic. "Perfect. Mrs. Margaret would be proud." Sarah felt the familiar bittersweet pang that Margaret's memory still brought, but it was softened now by gratitude for the time they had shared and the transformation that Margaret's love had made possible. The garden they had planted in Margaret's honor was thriving in the backyard, providing both fresh vegetables for their meals and a tangible connection to the woman who had taught them all that the most important ingredients in any recipe were attention and care. "Speaking of Mrs. Margaret," David said, pulling a small velvet box from his pocket, "I found something that belonged to her." Sarah's breath caught as she recognized Margaret's engagement ring, the simple solitaire that had been her grandmother's before it became her mother's. "David, what? Your mother gave this to me the day before she died. She said it belonged with someone who understood that love wasn't about grand gestures but about showing up every day and choosing each other again and again." Emma bounced on her toes with excitement. "Are you going to ask her to marry you for real this time, Daddy?" David knelt down beside Sarah, taking her hands in his and looking up at her with eyes full of certainty and tenderness. "Sarah Thompson, will you marry me? Not because of a crazy promise made in a moment of grief, but because I love who you are and who you're becoming and who we are together."
Sarah looked down at this man who had walked into her life disguised as a construction worker with homemade lunch and revealed himself to be exactly what she hadn't known she was looking for. Someone who challenged her to be better while loving her exactly as she was. Someone who had shown her that strength and vulnerability weren't opposites but partners. Yes, she said, laughing through tears as he slipped her mother's ring onto her finger. Yes, I'll marry you. Emma cheered and threw her arms around both of them, creating a tangle of limbs and laughter that would have looked chaotic to an outside observer but felt like the most natural thing in the world to the three people at its center. They were married 6 weeks later in Margaret's garden, surrounded by the same friends who had attended the hospital gathering that had started everything. Emma served as both flower girl and junior wedding coordinator, taking her responsibilities seriously while David and Sarah exchanged vows they had written themselves. I promise to show up for you every day, Sarah said, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. To choose connection over isolation, vulnerability over control and love over fear. I promise to challenge you to be your best self while loving you exactly as you are, David replied. To build a life with you that honors both our dreams and our daily realities. As they kissed to seal their promises, Sarah tasted salt and sweetness and possibility, flavors that would define their marriage as they learned to blend their individual lives into something richer and more nourishing than either had imagined possible. The reception featured food prepared by David with Emma's assistance, dishes that told the story of their unconventional courtship through flavors that spoke of comfort and celebration and the kind of love that grows stronger when shared. Sarah's business colleagues mingled with David's construction crew friends. Emma's school friends played with the children of Margaret's book club members, and everyone agreed that the food was extraordinary, but the joy was even better. Mrs. Margaret would have loved this, Emma announced during her impromptu speech, standing on a chair borrowed from the kitchen. She said the best parties are the ones where everyone feels like family. Sarah looked around at the gathering, seeing her mother's influence in every detail and feeling deeply grateful for the woman who had taught her that the most important legacy wasn't what you built but who you loved and how well you loved them. As the sun set over the garden Margaret had planted years before, Sarah and David danced to music played from a phone speaker while Emma and the other children ran through the sprinkler and guests lingered over dessert and stories. It wasn't the kind of wedding Sarah had imagined during her years of careful planning and risk management, but it was perfect in ways that had nothing to do with perfection and everything to do with joy. Later that evening, after the guests had departed and Emma had been tucked into bed with promises that the celebration would continue tomorrow with leftover cake for breakfast, Sarah and David sat on the porch swing Margaret had loved, sharing the comfortable silence of people who had found their way home to each other. Do you think she knew? Sarah asked, watching fireflies begin their evening dance across the garden, that we'd end up here. I think she hoped. I think she saw something in both of us that we couldn't see in ourselves. She gave us each other. She gave us permission to be brave enough to try. Sarah leaned into David's warmth, marveling at how completely her life had changed since the morning she had mocked a construction worker's homemade lunch. She had discovered that love wasn't the weakness she had always feared, but the strength she had never known she possessed. Emma appeared in the doorway in her pajamas, hair tousled from sleep and eyes bright with the kind of energy that suggested bedtime had been more theoretical than actual. Can I sit with you? She asked, and without waiting for an answer squeezed herself between them on the swing. What are you thinking about, sweetheart? David asked, wrapping his arm around his daughter. I'm thinking that Mrs. Margaret was right about families being about choosing each other, Emma said seriously. And I'm thinking that tomorrow we should make pancakes with the leftover peaches. Sarah laughed, kissing the top of Emma's head and feeling overwhelmed by the simple perfection of this moment. I think that sounds like an excellent plan. As they swayed gently in the gathering darkness, three people who had found each other through loss and laughter, and the transformative power of a well-cooked meal, Sarah understood finally what her mother had been trying to teach her all along. The best life wasn't the one you planned perfectly, but the one you embraced fully, with all its messy complications and unexpected blessings. Sometimes the most extraordinary love stories began with the most ordinary moments, and sometimes the person who saved your life was simply the one who remembered to pack lunch with care and serve it with kindness. Sarah had learned that success without connection was just elaborate loneliness, but love with partnership was the foundation for everything that mattered. The fireflies continued their ancient dance, the garden released its evening fragrances into the summer air, and 3 hearts beat in rhythm on a porch swing while the stars appeared one by one to witness the beginning of their life together. 5 years after their wedding, Sarah Martinez stood in the gleaming kitchen of their new home, watching through the large bay window as David taught 10-year-old Emma and 3-year-old Michael how to tend the vegetable garden that had become the heart of their family life. The morning sun caught the highlights in Emma's hair as she carefully showed her little brother how to water the tomato plants without drowning them, her patience with his enthusiastic but clumsy help a testament to the nurturing environment they had created together. The house itself was a compromise that perfectly reflected their blended priorities, large enough to accommodate Sarah's need for a proper home office, and David's desire for a workshop where he could pursue the custom furniture business he had started 2 years earlier, but warm and lived in enough that guests immediately felt welcome. The kitchen, designed by Sarah but built by David, featured professional-grade appliances alongside a farmhouse table that could seat 12 and usually did on Sunday afternoons when their extended family gathered for the weekly dinners that had become tradition. Sarah had discovered to her own surprise that she possessed a natural talent for entertaining that had been dormant during her years of professional isolation. The house regularly filled with a diverse mix of people, Emma's school friends and their parents, David's construction crew colleagues and their families, Sarah's business associates who had gradually become genuine friends, and the ever-present book club members who had adopted the Martinez family as honorary members after Margaret's death. "Mama Sarah, look," Michael called from the garden, holding up a carrot he had apparently liberated from the soil ahead of harvest time. His voice carried the particular excitement that 3-year-olds brought to minor discoveries, and Sarah felt the familiar warmth that came with being called Mama by this child who had arrived as a complete surprise 2 years into their marriage. Sarah's pregnancy had been unplanned and initially terrifying. At 35 she had convinced herself that motherhood was something she had missed her chance at, and the idea of balancing an infant with her CEO responsibilities had triggered every anxiety she thought she had overcome. But David had approached her fears with the same patient confidence he brought to everything else, and Emma had been so delighted at the prospect of a baby brother that her enthusiasm had gradually infected Sarah's cautious optimism. Michael David Martinez had arrived on a snowy February morning, after 12 hours of labor that had left Sarah convinced she
understood why women forgot the pain of childbirth. The moment the doctor placed him in her arms, sticky and squalling and perfect, she had felt something click into place that she hadn't known was missing. The fierce protective love that flooded through her had been different from her growing affection for Emma, more primal and immediate, but equally transformative. Watching him now as he toddled through the garden rows with dirt on his hands and joy on his face, Sarah marveled at how completely he had integrated into their family dynamic. Emma doted on him with the particular pride of an older sister who had helped choose his name and insisted on reading him bedtime stories even before he was old enough to understand them. David had approached fatherhood the second time with more confidence but no less wonder, spending hours lying on the floor making silly faces and airplane noises while Michael giggled with delight. The business world had initially been skeptical of Sarah's decision to have a child while serving as CEO of a rapidly growing company. Thompson Industries had expanded significantly under her leadership, now employing over 1,500 people across 3 states and specializing in sustainable technology solutions that had made Sarah something of a celebrity in environmental business circles. The board of directors had expressed polite concern about her ability to maintain her focus and dedication with the demands of a new baby. Sarah had addressed their concerns with characteristic directness during her first board meeting after announcing her pregnancy. She had presented detailed plans for maintaining operations during her maternity leave, demonstrated how modern technology would allow her to stay connected to essential decision-making, and pointed out that the company had thrived during the periods when she had worked remotely to care for her dying mother and adjust to married life. "Gentlemen," she had said, looking around the conference table at the collection of middle-aged men who had never faced the challenge of balancing motherhood with executive responsibility, "I have successfully grown this company by 300% over the past 5 years while learning to be a stepmother and wife. I think I can manage to continue that trajectory while adding one more family member to the mix." The maternity leave had been a revelation. Sarah had expected to spend the 3 months climbing the walls with anxiety about missing important developments and losing momentum in key initiatives. Instead, she had discovered that stepping away from the daily urgencies of business operations had given her a broader perspective on strategic planning and long-term vision. She returned to work more focused and efficient than before, with a clearer understanding of what truly required her personal attention versus what could be delegated to her increasingly capable team. The integration of motherhood with her professional life had required adjustments that surprised her with their creativity. Conference calls were scheduled around nap times, business trips were planned to minimize time away from home, and the company nursery she had reluctantly installed became a model that other corporations began to emulate. Michael often accompanied her to the office during his first year, sleeping in a portable crib in the corner of her office while she conducted meetings and reviewed reports. David had been her anchor through all of these adjustments, taking on primary childcare responsibilities during her busiest periods while continuing to build his furniture business into something that was attracting attention from interior designers throughout the Pacific Northwest. His pieces, crafted with the same attention to detail he brought to cooking and parenting, featured clean lines and sustainable materials that appealed to clients who valued both aesthetics and environmental responsibility. The workshop he had built behind their house had become his sanctuary, a space where he could lose himself in the meditative process of shaping wood into functional art while keeping one ear tuned for family needs. Emma often joined him there after school, learning to use basic tools and developing an appreciation for craftsmanship that balanced her academic interests in science and mathematics. Their partnership had evolved into something that felt both natural and deliberately constructed, built on daily negotiations and mutual respect rather than traditional gender roles. David handled most of the cooking and household management, tasks that came easily to him and that Sarah approached with dutiful competence rather than enthusiasm. Sarah managed the family finances and major planning decisions, leveraging skills that translated seamlessly from boardroom to domestic life. Emma had blossomed in this environment of shared responsibility and demonstrated affection. Now 15, she moved between her parents with easy confidence, seeking David's advice on creative projects and friendship drama while turning to Sarah for academic guidance and career counseling. The transition to adolescence had brought the expected challenges, but Emma's fundamental security in being loved and valued had provided a foundation that made even the difficult phases manageable. "Mom, can Jesse come over for dinner tonight?" Emma asked as she entered the kitchen with Michael trailing behind her, both of them dusted with soil and radiating the particular satisfaction that came from productive morning work. Sarah considered the request while automatically beginning the process of cleaning Michael's hands and face. Jessie Chen had become Emma's closest friend over the past year, a thoughtful girl whose parents Sarah had grown to appreciate for their shared values around education and family time. Of course, but call her mother to make sure it's okay and ask what time she needs to be picked up. And wash your hands properly before you touch anything else. Already texting her, Emma replied, demonstrating the kind of efficient multitasking that made Sarah proud despite her occasional concerns about teenagers and their relationship with technology. David entered through the back door carrying a basket of vegetables that would become the foundation for their lunch, his hair slightly mussed and his work shirt bearing the evidence of a morning spent in productive collaboration with soil and plants. At 42 he had acquired the kind of comfortable confidence that came from knowing exactly who he was and what mattered to him. The lines around his eyes spoke of laughter and outdoor work, and his hands bore the calluses of someone who built things with care and attention. "Good harvest this morning," he announced, setting the basket on the counter and kissing Sarah with the casual affection of long marriage. "The tomatoes are finally coming in properly," and Emma convinced Michael that pulling weeds was actually a treasure hunt. "Treasures," Michael echoed enthusiastically, apparently still captivated by the morning's adventure in garden maintenance. Sarah watched David begin to sort through the vegetables, automatically planning a meal that would showcase their freshness while appealing to the varied tastes of their family and potential guests. His movements in the kitchen had the same deliberate grace she remembered from that first morning when he had made peach cobbler for her dying mother, but now they were seasoned with years of experience and the particular efficiency that came from cooking for a family with evolving needs and preferences. "Jesse's coming for dinner," Sarah informed him, knowing he would adjust the menu accordingly without complaint or stress. "Perfect. I was planning to make that pasta with the roasted vegetables anyway, and there's plenty." Her mother mentioned last week that Jesse's been asking about learning to cook, so maybe we can get her involved in the preparation. This was typical of David's approach to hosting, turning every meal into an opportunity for connection and education. Over the years, their dinner table had become an informal classroom where children learned about nutrition and food preparation while adults engaged in conversations that ranged from current events to family history, to philosophical discussions about values and priorities. Sarah had initially been intimidated by the prospect of regular entertaining, remembering her mother's elaborate garden parties and feeling inadequate by comparison. But David had taught her that hospitality wasn't about perfection or performance but about creating space for people to feel valued and comfortable. Their dinner parties were characterized more by laughter and good conversation than by flawless presentation, and guests often lingered for hours after the meal had ended, reluctant to leave an environment that felt like an extension of family. "I should probably call Robert about the quarterly projections before lunch," Sarah said, glancing at her phone to check the time and noting several missed calls from her assistant that would need to be returned. "Take your time," David replied, already beginning to wash the vegetables. "Michael and I are going to start bread for tonight, aren't we, buddy?" Michael nodded seriously, clearly delighted by the prospect of helping with bread making, a process that had become one of his favorite activities due to the combination of mess making and magical transformation it involved. Sarah retreated to her home office, a space that had been designed to accommodate both focused work and family interruptions. Floor-to-ceiling windows provided natural light and views of the garden, while sound-dampening materials allowed her to conduct confidential conversations without completely isolating herself from household activities. A comfortable seating area in one corner allowed for informal meetings with colleagues who preferred the relaxed atmosphere of her home office to the corporate environment downtown. The call with Robert, her chief financial officer, covered the expected territory of revenue projections and market analysis, but Sarah found her attention occasionally drifting to the sounds of her family in the kitchen. Michael's laughter mixed with David's patient explanations about measuring flour, creating a domestic symphony that had become the soundtrack to her most productive working hours. Thompson Industries had continued to grow under her leadership, but Sarah had learned to define success in broader terms than pure financial metrics. The company culture she had fostered emphasized work-life balance and family support, policies that had initially been driven by her own needs but had proven to attract and retain exceptional talent across all levels of the organization. The nursery that had started as accommodation for Michael had evolved into a comprehensive childcare facility that served employees throughout the company. Flexible scheduling options allowed parents to attend school events and family obligations without compromising their professional responsibilities. The result had been increased productivity and loyalty that more than offset the costs of these employee benefits. "Sarah, you've created something special here," Robert said as their call was winding down. "The employee satisfaction surveys are showing record highs and our retention rates are significantly better than industry averages. Whatever you're doing to balance growth with company culture, it's working." Sarah felt a familiar sense of pride in the organization she had built, but it was tempered now by awareness of the personal costs that single-minded professional focus could exact. "Robert, success isn't just about numbers on a balance sheet. If our people are happy and fulfilled, they do better work. If they feel supported in their whole lives, not just their professional roles, they bring more creativity and energy to their jobs." After ending the call, Sarah remained in her office for a few minutes, reviewing emails and approving decisions that her team had flagged for her attention. The rhythm of remote work had become natural over the years, allowing her to maintain oversight of company operations while being present for family needs. She had learned to distinguish between issues that required her immediate personal attention and those that could be handled by her capable team, a delegation skill that had made both her professional and personal life more sustainable. When she returned to the kitchen, she found David and Michael covered in flour and deeply engaged in the serious business of kneading bread dough. Emma had joined them, and was attempting to teach Michael the proper technique for folding the dough, her natural teaching instincts emerging as she patiently corrected his enthusiastic but imprecise movements. "How did the call go?" David asked without looking up from his demonstration of proper kneading technique. "Good. Robert thinks we're on track for another strong quarter, and the employee satisfaction surveys are showing excellent results." "That's great, but how do you feel about it?" Sarah considered the question, appreciating how David always asked about her emotional response to professional developments rather than just their practical implications. Proud but not surprised. When you create an environment where people can be whole human beings instead of just workers, they perform better in every way. "Sounds like you learned something important about integration." Sarah smiled at his gentle observation. David had a gift for helping her recognize her own growth without making it feel like a lesson or lecture. "I learned it from watching you balance everything with such grace. You showed me that success in one area of life doesn't have to come at the expense of everything else." Emma looked up from her bread-making supervision. "Is that why you always say that the best decisions consider everyone who's affected by them?" "Exactly. Whether it's a business decision or a family decision, you have to think about how it impacts all the people you care about." "Michael, who had been listening to this conversation with the serious attention that 3-year-olds brought to adult discussions they didn't fully understand, suddenly announced, "Bread makes everyone happy." The simple observation triggered laughter from the entire family, a recognition of the truth contained in his innocent comment. Bread, like all the meals David prepared with care and attention, did indeed make people happy in ways that extended far beyond mere nutrition. As the afternoon progressed, their home filled with the particular energy that came from successful family coordination. Emma's friend Jessie arrived and was immediately incorporated into the dinner preparation process, her curiosity about cooking techniques leading to an impromptu lesson in sauce preparation and seasoning. Michael appointed himself as chief taste tester, a role he took seriously despite his limited palate and tendency to approve of everything that contained sufficient amounts of cheese. David moved through the controlled chaos with the calm efficiency of someone who had learned to orchestrate multiple activities simultaneously. He guided Jessie through the process of roasting vegetables while keeping one eye on Michael's attempts to help set the table and maintaining a running conversation with Emma about her upcoming science fair project. Sarah found herself watching this domestic ballet with the same appreciation she brought to observing a well-run business meeting. Everyone had a role, everyone contributed according to their abilities, and the end result was greater than the sum of its parts. It had taken her years to understand that family life could be approached with the same strategic thinking she applied to business challenges, but without the competitive edge that made corporate environments exhausting. "Sarah, come help us with the pasta water," David called, and she joined the group around the stove, taking direction from Emma about the proper ratio of salt to water, while Jessie asked thoughtful questions about how different cooking techniques affected nutritional content. This was the part of their life together that Sarah treasured most, the ordinary moments when they functioned as a seamless unit, each person contributing their strengths while accommodating others' needs and limitations. It was the kind of partnership she had never imagined possible during her years of professional isolation, when she had believed that love was a luxury she couldn't afford and family was a distraction from more important pursuits. Dinner unfolded with the relaxed pace that characterized their best family meals. Conversation flowed easily between Emma's school experiences, David's current furniture commissions, Sarah's upcoming business travel, and Michael's detailed analysis of which vegetables were acceptable and which were clearly designed to torture small children. Jessie contributed observations about her own family's cooking traditions, leading to a discussion about cultural differences in food preparation that turned into an impromptu geography lesson. "Mrs. Martinez, do you ever miss not having to think about family stuff when you're trying to work?" Jessie asked with the directness that teenagers brought to questions adults often avoided. Sarah considered the question seriously, recognizing the assumption underlying it that success required sacrifice and that professional achievement was incompatible with personal fulfillment. "Jessie, I spent the first part of my career believing that I had to choose between being successful and being connected to people. I thought that caring about family would make me weak or distracted in business situations, but it doesn't. Actually, it makes me stronger. When you have people you love depending on you, you make better decisions because you're thinking about long-term consequences, not just short-term gains. And when you have a home that feels like a refuge, you can take bigger risks in your professional life because you know you have a safe place to land if things don't work out." Emma nodded as if this confirmed something she had already suspected. "Plus, when you're happy at home you're nicer to work with, so people want to help you succeed." David smiled at his daughter's practical analysis. Emma's been observing workplace dynamics since she was old enough to visit Sarah's office. She has some interesting theories about management techniques. "I think the best bosses are the ones who remember that everyone has a life outside of work," Emma said with the confidence of someone who had spent years watching her stepmother navigate the challenge of leading people while respecting their humanity. As the evening wound down and Jessie was collected by her parents, Sarah found herself reflecting on how completely her understanding of success had evolved. The metrics that mattered now included not just financial performance and market share, but also the quality of her relationships, the health of her family, and the impact she was having on the people whose lives intersected with hers. Later that night, after Michael had been bathed and read to and tucked into bed with his collection of stuffed animals, and Emma had finished her homework with David's help with the mathematical concepts that challenged her, Sarah and David found themselves alone in their bedroom for the first time all day. "Good day?" David asked as they went through the ritual of preparing for sleep that had become second nature over 5 years of marriage. "Very good day. The kind of day that reminds me why we make all the effort to balance everything." David smiled, recognizing the contentment in her voice that indicated she was feeling successful in all the ways that mattered to her now. Michael's getting excited about starting preschool next month. Are you ready for that transition?
I think so.
It'll be strange not having him around during the day, but I'm looking forward to having more focused time for the furniture business, and he needs the social interaction with other kids his age. Sarah settled into bed beside him, marveling as she often did at how natural this domestic intimacy had become.
Do you ever regret giving up the construction work to focus more on family and the custom furniture?
David considered the question seriously.
No.
The construction work was necessary for a certain phase of my life, but it wasn't what I was meant to do long term. Building furniture allows me to be creative while still working with my hands, and the flexible schedule means I can be present for all the family stuff that matters, and you don't miss the steady paycheck and benefits. Sarah, we're fortunate enough that your income provides financial security for our family. That gives me the freedom to pursue work that's personally fulfilling rather than just economically necessary. Not everyone has that luxury, and I don't take it for granted. Sarah felt the familiar gratitude that came with recognition of how much they had both gained from their partnership. David's presence had allowed her to pursue professional ambitions without sacrificing family relationships, while her financial success had given him the freedom to develop his artistic talents without compromising their family's security. David, do you think we're good at this? At being married and raising children and running businesses, and maintaining friendships and all the rest of it? I think we're good at trying. I think we've figured out that being good at marriage isn't about being perfect, it's about being committed to working through problems together and adjusting when things aren't working. And the children? Emma is turning into an amazing young woman who feels secure enough to take risks and kind enough to care about other people. Michael is happy and curious in developing his own personality. I think we're doing okay with the parenting. Sarah curled against David's side, taking comfort in his solid warmth and steady breathing. Sometimes I can't believe how different my life is from what I expected it would be. Better or worse than expected?
Better.
So much better that I sometimes feel like I'm living someone else's life. The old Sarah would never have believed that it was possible to be successful professionally and fulfilled personally at the same time. The old Sarah didn't know what she was capable of when she had the right support system. Sarah was quiet for a moment, processing the truth of his observation. You know what I'm most proud of?
What?
That Michael will grow up thinking this is normal. That it's normal for fathers to cook and mothers to run companies, for families to make decisions together, for work and love to support each other instead of competing. He won't have to unlearn the idea that you have to choose between being successful and being happy. David kissed the top of her head, understanding the gift she was describing. And Emma will know that being strong and being loved aren't mutually exclusive. Do you think your mother would be proud of what we've built? I think she'd love that you learned how to savor things. I think she'd be amazed by how much joy you find in ordinary moments now. Sarah smiled in the darkness, remembering Margaret's challenge to pay attention to life's sweetness instead of just managing its logistics. She was right about the marriage promise being crazy. Completely insane, David agreed. But she was also right that sometimes crazy is exactly what people need to break through their own limitations. I love you, Sarah said, the words carrying the weight of daily choice rather than just emotional impulse.
I love you too.
All of you, all of this, everything we've created together. As they settled into sleep, Sarah felt the deep satisfaction that came from a life that felt both purposeful and joyful. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and decisions, another day of balancing professional responsibilities with family needs, but she faced it with the confidence of someone who had learned that success was measured not in what you accumulated but in what you shared. The house settled around them, filled with the presence of sleeping children and the lingering warmth of a day well lived. In the kitchen, bread dough rose slowly in preparation for tomorrow's meals, a testament to the patient work of building something nourishing from simple ingredients, time and attention. Outside, Margaret's garden continued its seasonal cycle, producing abundance that would feed both body and spirit for the family that had learned to tend it with the same care they brought to tending each other. And in the quiet darkness, 3 generations slept peacefully, secure in the knowledge that love was not a luxury to be rationed but a renewable resource that grew stronger when shared generously. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.